Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tree Actions, the Human Forestry Podcast. With me, as always, is my partner in fun, Tony Tresholt. Hey, Tony. And joining us today is Mr. Dan Groves. And actually, I'm not upstate New York, I believe. I'm not sure exactly the location, but uh, welcome, Dan, to Tree Actions.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I use that word loosely here, but good to see you, Dwayne. Good to see you, Tony. Thanks for having me on today.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming out.
We like to kick things off with a question. And the question is, Dan, if you would please be willing to share with us the first time that you can recall having a meaningful connection or memory or experience with a tree or trees.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. So, Dwayne, I am in upstate New York. I'm in the Adirondacks near Lake Placid.
Oh,
And
beautiful.
yeah, it is beautiful. It's a great area, beautiful mountainous area. And a friend of mine once sort of characterized it as the land of the white pine and the brook trout.
Ah, yes.
He's right. They're both kind of ubiquitous. They're everywhere. So I got to say, I think white pine has sort of thread itself through my life from early on. I grew up on a really small farm down near the Pennsylvania border near Binghamton, New York, and
Wow, okay.
yeah, it wasn't much of a farm, but it was my playground of my youth, and outside my bedroom was this row of about 13 white pines along the road. And I can remember sitting there listening to the wind, like rustling through those pine trees. And it
Yeah.
just, I don't know, it called to me. It was just always like, oh, there's the wind in the pine trees again. And I could look right outside my bedroom window and just see this wall of green needles, and they were pretty good sized trees. They were pretty cool trees. And so that I think kind of like started sparking my interest about trees. And growing up on a farm, being a farm boy, of course, spent plenty of time in the fields. But there was a patch of woods, and you could always find me there. Like that was my safe haven. So I was always up in the woods more so than running around on the farm. It's like that was kind of my sanctuary, and that's where I would go and check out trees and just like camp out. My first camping experience was underneath a white pine, and it was mostly hardwoods up in those woods, but there was a few white pines, and I think that kind of actually made it that much more interesting for me. That white pines weren't everywhere, that they were sort of the anomaly amongst the hardwood forest. So when you did see one, it was like, oh, cool, there's a pine, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I think white pines have just always kind of like enamored me right from the get-go. And on that farm, um, a lot of open space, of course. I do remember planting a silver maple for my grandmother who lived across the road, and the tree is still there. I can't believe it.
Wow.
What is it, 150 years old now? Well, not quite that.
Right, right.
Yeah, but and then it's funny. I moved to the Adirondacks, and here you just have like these really spectacular specimens of white pines. I mean, some really incredible trees, old growth. There's trees, white pine trees up here that haven't ever been cut. And they're 4 or 5
Wow.
years old, and just great big massive trunks. And of course, the pines up here are pretty tall too. Down in the farmland, sometimes they were weevilled, or the tops would break out of them or whatever. So sometimes they're multi-stemmed. But the pines up here in the Adirondacks are just so pristine, single
Wow.
stem, big tall trees. And I don't know, I've always kind of said, I want my coffin to be made out of rough cut white pine.
What is it that like is that like in my experience having worked in and amongst some of the eastern US, there's a lot of, I remember being in, I want to say it was somewhere in upstate New York. It might have been Mass. I'm not sure. Somewhere in New England areas. It was New England, I believe. But we were working at this. It was a state forest type thing, and it was forested. But their pictures on the wall in the building showed everything cut. because it had been logged, like in the 40s or something, maybe 50s. I don't know when, but they're all black and white photos, and there was no trees. And you could see where the building I was in was newly built at that time. Now it's this old building, and there's massive trees all around, white pines included, and oaks. But it's like it was all logged. So I'm curious how you have why like they just were why weren't they logged where you're at?
Yeah, that's a good question. The really old growth trees up here that weren't logged were in really difficult places to access. So,
Okay.
just really remote areas, or maybe there's these at the south end of the upper Ausable Lake. So, the Ausable Lakes are the headwaters of the Ausable River, which is world class trout fishing. But, anyways, there's two lakes up there, and it's on a private reserve, something like 12,000 acres. And you can't really get to these trees very easily, but there's these two old white pines that are on this little spit of land surrounded by lakes and wetlands and the river and things like that. And you just can't get to them very easily. And
Oh,
these trees are ancient. And so they're called the sentinel pines. Like everybody knows them and loves them up there. So,
okay.
yeah, the big old white pines, of course, Dwayne, white pines do grow fast. One of the interesting things that I kind of appreciate about pines is they are a pioneer species. I mean, they come in after a
Yeah.
disturbance. They love sun, they're not very shade tolerant, but they're long lived. So it's like you get these trees, they grow really rapidly, but then they can also live for hundreds of years. So they're kind of an anomaly like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't say. I don't know that I don't recall right off the top of my head anywhere I've seen 500-year-old specimens of that species. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's really interesting about them, like the sentinel pines that I was telling you about, is the really old growth white pines, the ones that are, 300 plus, have hardly any branches on them because over time, they've just shed their branches from all the
Yeah.
storms. They're some of the ugliest pines that you've ever seen. I mean, they're big and they're statuesque, but they have such an irregular crown. And it's just like they'll have two or three. I hesitate to call them leaders, but that's really what they are. But two or three branches or leaders that sustain the entire canopy for this thing. So when you
Wow.
look at them, they're like, they're kind of like splotchy. They've got like a one growth here, one growth there. And yeah, that's one of the ways you can tell that they're sort of an old growth pine is just how irregular
Okay.
the canopy is.
Yeah. I was going to
Yeah,
ask you if they have a mature, like Doug firs, for example, get really flat, blunt topped. They lose their point and they get, when they get big and old like that. And I was wondering if there was a similar phenomenon with them. And obviously there is. Yeah.
yeah. I think the bark is a little platier too. It kind of almost gets these bigger plates on the bark. White pine typically has sort of almost like a scaly bark,
Yeah.
almost
Yeah.
almost like a black cherry or something in the beginning, after the smooth section there. But yeah, yeah, white pines are pretty neat. They've kind of been in my lifeblood. A lot of people, and I'm sure you guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I'm sure that you guys have run across people saying, well, Tony or Dwayne, what's your favorite tree? Because they know that trees are in our blood.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I have a hard time answering that question, to be honest with you, because I don't want to have a favorite tree. And one of my quips was like, kind of like a quick comeback is just like, well, whatever tree I'm in, or
Yeah.
whatever the
Right.
last tree was that I climbed, because it's such a blessing to be able to climb trees at this age. So that's true. But I have to say that white pine is like way up there on the list.
Yeah. I agree. I have a hard time picking one. I can't say that I guess I frustrate people with as well. I can't say specifically one, and and it can change depending where I'm at. Like different regions, there's favorites in those regions because they're so different. And a lot of times it's a tree from youth or something where you've grown up or whatever. But um, yeah, I can't. I just, trees in general are my favorite things, I guess. I don't know, Tony, can you narrow it down or are you kind of
Yeah, I
broad?
like I like Kentucky coffee trees because they're just big trees
Oh,
with places that you can stand and work.
Oh, nice.
That's what well, they're when they get very large down here and get mature, they're very, the structure is very similar to like an American elm. So they get very broad, very deciduous. I mean, I've been in Kentucky coffee trees that they might only be 70 or 80 feet tall, but they're 120 foot in crown spread. And they just like, they don't, the branch unions are of suitable size for my boots. The bark has good traction. They're pretty tough trees. They're strong like an oak, so you can tie into just about anything that's reasonable, and it's going to hold you and be fine. So they're a lot of they're fun trees to climb from a technical standpoint, and you get the
I,
big long beans on them, which are kind of cool. And the pith of the small is pink, and you can actually poke it out with a like on the small limbs. It's very soft. It's almost like foam, and you can poke it out and make all kinds of whistles and stuff. It's kind of
Oh,
fun.
really?
really,
Mm.
Huh.
it's definitely my most favorite Latin name. Gymnocladus glyptostroboides. Like it's
Mhm.
like they're badass Latin name.
Yeah,
I
it's
don't even, I
fun
don't know
stuff.
what it means if there's a translation for that, but like wow, that's a cool name. That's one reason I always never forget it.
Hmm.
I don't know the family though. What family is it in?
Oh, I can't remember. I'd have to
I
look
think
it up.
it's because it has those legumes, right? So I think it's in the Fabaceae family.
Legumaceae. Or Fabaceae.
I think so.
Yeah, you're
Or
probably right.
yeah, I think so.
Fabaceae and then Legumaceae might be the subspecies or a subfamily. But Fabaceae, you're probably right. Hmm,
Yeah.
interesting.
And the
Because
coffee
Yeah,
is
is no
that,
Fabaceae the
different.
family, is black locust Fabaceae?
I think so.
Gladitia tricanthos, is it Fabaceae family? Maybe it is. In Gladitia and Gymnocladus, maybe they are the same genus or the same family as locusts. Anyways,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, that's always a fun question, to ask people. It's like, what is your favorite tree? Like up here in the Adirondacks too, we have a lot of folks who are, it's a big second home, like resort area. And so there's people that come here from all over the world. And one of the questions I like to ask people is, well, how did you end up in the Adirondacks? And like, it's just kind of cool to like sort of pull their stories out of them, ask those little questions that just kind of like open doors for all sorts of great conversations.
It seems like it's one of those places that has like there's a lot of people there, but not many people from there, like where they're born and raised. I mean, there obviously is, but probably more people end up there than were born and raised there.
So true. Yeah, Dwayne, I went to Paul Smith College, which is here, 20 minutes from my house. And although my dad had brought me up on a hunting trip when I was probably like 12 years old, which was, well, another story, that the hunting trip was sort of like living out a Jack London novel or something. It was like it's more of a survival story than anything. But irregardless, I fell in love with the Adirondacks on that trip. But it's funny because the town of Saranac Lake, where I live, I think half the population went to Paul Smith College. It's like they're just like me, they come up, they fall in love with the area, and they never leave.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
So your foray into the arboriculture realm, how and when did that get happen for you? How did you go from white pines talking to you outside your bedroom window to actually working in trees?
Mm, yeah. That's a loaded question. Well, I definitely always had an affinity for trees and decided that I wanted to go to forestry school for something. At first, I thought I might want to be a forest ranger. And there's another college up here called the Ranger School, which is part of the SUNY ESF program. And I ended up not making it into that one. So I went to Paul Smith instead by default, which worked out just great. But while I was at Paul Smith College, I was taking this forest soils course, which was taught by this amazing guy, Dr. Michael Kudish. And Kudish was just such an eccentric professor. He just like really drew people in with his knowledge and his passion, of course, which is what, as you guys know, that's a great combination for a teacher to have, knowledge and passion. So I was in forest soils class, and there was only like 6 of us in the whole class, and we had such a great time, because every field trip, every class was just, this amazing exchange of ideas. And so one of the students in the class was Matt Morrison, and Matt had run Olympic tree service up here in the Adirondacks since about I think he started in like 78 or 79, just before the Winter Olympics were in Lake Placid.
Okay.
And so Matt was just taking classes, on and off. And so we bumped into each other, and I started doing tree work on the weekends, and he's like, "Hey, you guys, you want to come out and drag brush with me?" Sure. I didn't know how bad dragging brush could be or how fun it could be, but we had a really great time. And so Matt hired me and a buddy from college, Andy. The 3 of us would go out and do tree jobs on the weekends during the semester and stuff. And then um, after we graduated, I actually had a job lined up as a land surveyor. And but I really wanted to stay in the Adirondacks. I didn't want to move back to Binghamton, New York. I wanted to
Right,
stay
right.
here in the mountains. So Matt was like, "Well, why don't you guys come and work for me?" So, okay, sure. If it keeps me in the Adirondacks, I'll do that. So, I started learning about tree work, and yeah, just really having a great time with it up here. And I still remember the first tree that I rappelled out of. Matt was like a real traditionalist. He was what we would call a cowboy at the time.
Mhm.
We would spike up trees and then tie in, once he got up to the first limb, and one-handed chainsaw cuts. And I'll never forget, we used to run those old Echo top-handled tree saws.
Yeah, yeah,
They were effective. I think they were 280s or something like that.
yeah, yeah.
He would take a pair of bolt cutters and cut the chain brake off of them because they got in the way.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty pretty hardcore, beginning, but you only know what you know, right? I mean, it's like, that's your proving ground right there. So we would do all the same thing, and PPE was optional, of course, back in the day. One-handed chainsaw cuts all the time. It was crazy, it was just like that was the world we lived in back then. And of course, the standards for the industry weren't anywhere near what they are today.
No, no.
The ANC was around, but it wasn't well known. So yeah, we just did cowboy tree work for a while, and then Matt ended up taking off and followed his girlfriend down to Washington D.C. And he said to my buddy Andy and I, and he's like, "Why don't you guys just take over the business and keep going?" So we did. And we didn't know what the hell we were doing. It was chaos. It was just like we were young and dumb and strong and just out of college. And now that we had our college degree, we really thought we knew everything.
Right, 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 right.
Yeah.
Well, it's so often the case, when you think back to what you thought was possible, or you didn't even think of what was possible. You just kind of did. And, I think back to when I started, some of the things I started in my career, I would be very hesitant to do it now, but I had no hesitation back 20, 30, 25, 30 years ago. Uh, the gift of youth has some advantages there, right?
Yeah, very much.
So, it sounds a little similar to my progression. I was involved in production tree work and then helping run companies before I got involved in education at a college level. How did that evolve?
Yeah. So um, I was a few years into it. My buddy Andy ended up leaving too. He went out to Washington State and started up a tree service out there called AB's Tree Service because he really liked the fir trees out there.
Yeah,
So um, I was just kind of hiring on people and doing tree work on my own. And it was a really small company. It was me and an old dump truck, and a few chainsaws and some ropes and rigging. Nothing really elaborate, but it was making a living. it was where I wanted to be and doing kind of what I wanted to do as much as I knew at that time. And it was it was 1993, and Andy had moved out west and was running his tree service. Actually, he just came back east and visited me about this time of year. It was right about November, and then about 2 months later, he died in a logging accident out there. He was felling a tree, and the top broke out of the tree, came
Yeah.
back up to him. The homeowner heard the chainsaw just idling away up in the woods, went up and found him, and he had been killed instantly. It was, a big tragedy, and
Yeah.
that really affected me greatly. Obviously, that it was terrible to lose a friend like that.
Yeah.
Um, and it was just, literally, so that was, early 1994. And right at the same time, the college asked me, there was a vacancy for coming in as a technical instructor, is what the term was back then, to come in and help out Randall Swanson, who was the lead instructor for the arboriculture program at Paul Smith College. So Randall needed somebody to come in and help out with labs and
Yeah.
climbing, stuff like that. And he asked me if I would do it, and I did. I was really happy to come back to the college and sort of be a part of it. But it was also like a really transformational time for me, because here, Andy and I, we thought we were bulletproof, as so many people do at that age and that time of their lives. And Andy's death really rocked my world, because I'm like, oh my God, Andy was just as good or better than I am.
Yeah.
And it happened to him, it could happen to me, So it really sort of shook my foundations. And then within a couple months, I'm thrust into being an instructor for these college students, in the profession. It just killed my buddy. And now I was kind of like, wow, this is a radical change for me,
Mm.
That was a
I'm
tough time.
curious. Did you like? I'm sure you went and asked the questions at the time, but like having years now to reflect, is there? Can you see what happened, or is there more understanding of what took place in resulting in that fatality? I mean, obviously he didn't plan for it, but um, have you
Yeah,
had any peace come from learning more? Or
I have. Yeah, and I think that I I mention Andy's fatality as a learning tool, you know,
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
and it certainly was for me, and I want it to be for other people as well. So, a couple of things is, back then we weren't using the Swedish felling method. So, we
right,
weren't using a bore cut, open face notch. We were using conventional and, chase the hinge wood across the back cut.
yeah, yeah,
So, I'm sure that kept him closer to the stump,
right,
than maybe what we would do today. Um, and then, there's, the issue of risk assessment. We were, um, well, I guess I would just say, I think the whole process of risk assessment today is much better than it was back then in the early
okay,
90s. I think
yeah,
that we know more,
yeah,
but I think that safety overall has progressed so much more. And, you can even see this in modern media today. If you were to watch, like, I don't know, a John Wayne movie like The Sands of Iwo Jima, it's like you'd be hard pressed to find the soldier on that, the head is like chin strap buckled, And
right,
now,
right,
like, watch some modern, uh, war movie, for instance, and they've got all sorts of PPE on. They've got
yeah.
safety glasses on. The helmets all buckled up. So I think as a society, we've progressed quite a bit along those lines.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think the hazard risk assessment of a worker in the field has progressed, and I really think that using the bore cut method in certain situations can be very valuable for getting you away.
Yeah, I think it was probably the biggest eye opener for me when I learned that technique from Tim Ard back in the day, and it was also what question made me wonder why the heck I was in this class. Like it was a prerequisite to move on to a rigging class that I wanted to take. And I thought, oh, well, whatever, I'll just do that felling. I had no intention of learning anything. I didn't think I needed to learn anything. It was just you know, something I had to do. And I probably learned more in that class than any of the rest. And that was one of them. One of the things, the open notch, particularly the bore cut, and being able to eliminate variables like how close you are when the tree moves, and the whole concept of being there while it's starting to fall, and that 5 foot radius of risk, and that those first seconds the tree starts to move, like what we call the 5-15-90 rule now, or many of us do, I should say. It made so much sense. And having had experience, I'd had limbs hit me in the head. I've got one in particular early in my career where a limb just, dislodged and hit me hard, like, but not, obviously it didn't kill me or injure me, but man, it was close. Like I felt it, and it hurt. It took me out. Like it was and had I known what I learned later, I would have been able to avoid that. Not just and including, if you recall, the game of logging mantra, right? Like step one, right, is your height and hazards, right? Step
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny because in that transformational time too, I can remember, so at Paul Smith's with the ARB class, it starts out really slow. Obviously you're not climbing on the first day.
Yeah.
You got to learn some knots, and we do get them up climbing pretty quickly in the trees, but it's a progression, as you guys know. So I can remember when we got to the point where we were doing tree removals, and Randall asked me, he said, Dan, will you, here's a hemlock. I want you to go up, limb it out. We'll tip the top out. You can show them how to chunk and dunk a little bit and then come on down. And it wasn't a terribly large tree. So I did the demonstration, and I get back down to the ground, left a stick so we could pull the stick over. And
Mhm.
I get to the ground, I'm kind of go over to him, and I said, so how was that? Was that what you were looking for? And he says, yeah, except for all the one-handed chainsaw cuts.
Right, right.
And at that moment, I knew that, I needed to transform myself, because now I was a teacher. If it was just Dan with his little old tree service out there making one-handed chainsaw cuts, nobody was going to hold me accountable. And I wasn't, impressing upon these young minds how to work safely and properly. So that was a really great moment for me. It was very humbling. I was kind of like, oh, you know, that was my bad, right? But
Yeah, yeah,
it made me embrace safety throughout my entire life, and not just like, oh, I have to be safe in front of the students, or yeah, you're going to be safe here, but the just sort of like, do as I say but not as I do kind of thing. And it
hmm,
made
right.
me think about safety it differently, that I was impressionable to these young people, these young minds that were just really a fresh lump of clay, and if you did something like that in front of them, then they're going to record that and think, well, Dan did it, so it's
Yeah,
okay for. I'm sure you guys have similar experience.
yeah. No, I agree 100%. And and I want to just step back for a minute, because you mentioned cowboy tree service in the beginning. So I'm curious what you had for gear, equipment. Like, what did you climb on? What was your harness? What kind of lanyard do you remember the knot you used? Like, what was your first setup?
Oh yeah, yeah. um so the first harness, uh I think it was an old Weaver. And again, we were all about making things our own, and so we would cut off one leg strap, so we only had one leg strap on, because that was a cool thing to do for whatever reason. I guess
Oh,
kind of
really?
tuck your stuff to one side and have the strap on the other. But so yeah, we had an old, the old fabric Weaver leather
Yeah.
harnesses, with the two D rings up front and then the side rings. Um, We would climb. So we would climb on a 3 wrap taut line.
Yeah.
That was we climbed on a suicide taut line. Um, Again, we would often, if it was a removal, we would just spike up. Sometimes, if it wasn't a removal, we would just spike up the tree and then throw your lanyard around when you got there. Or even, I can remember a couple times, with the old rope snap, just throwing that around. Of course, when you're tying a taut line, you got the rope snap and then a couple, 2 or 3 feet of tail to be able to form
Yeah.
your hitch. And I mean, we got to the point where we could do that essentially, with one hand up in the air. You'd actually hold your body weight with
Yeah.
the rope and then tie it with your left hand,
Yeah.
which is insane. And I was up in this, again, a white pine on this property, and this was um, after Matt was long gone, after Andy was gone, and I'm just like churning away the work, and pounding out trees, and I'm doing this, and I sit there and I think, why am I doing it like this? Like, I'm 60 feet up if I fall right now, for whatever reason, like, it's going to be awful. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm literally thinking to myself, I hope that I die if I do fall, because I don't want somebody to like wipe my ass for the rest of my life. you know,
Right. Right.
That's kind of, this just, it's not fair to everybody else to behave,
Man,
you know?
I remember that, like, cause I was trained originally never, no spurs. In fact, it was so anti-spur, the company I was at, that we didn't even use them for removal. So like spurs were just bad, period. I was first trained like what are spurs are just not to be used, right? So never
Uh-huh.
ever use spurs. But there'd be lots of times where, like you say, go to tie in, you'd pull the fall, have the tail off, and you'd hold that while you tied. And you're leaning back, however many feet below you, behind you. But
Right.
it's that repetitive, that complacency that comes with having done something, right? And, and feeling quite sure of my grip and so on. And I never did obviously slip and fall, but yeah, it's just a risk that, not even thinking to just put my lanyard on. Like, I could just put the lanyard on and then I wouldn't have to worry, but it just, you just didn't think about it. It was interesting. You weren't showing, you weren't trained either, right? It was,
Right.
well, you saw the other guys do it that way. So that's the way you did
Well,
it.
exactly. You only know what you know. You guys know Tobias Wagon, obviously.
Absolutely.
So Tobias has got a great story, and probably you guys know this, but um, so he was always taught. Of course, he was working for Hartwood down in Charlotte, North Carolina. That was kind of
Hmm.
his, and so everybody said, you always have to have two hands on a saw. And so he's up there and he's two-handing branches with his handsaw, and he's rigging them down because he has to have two hands on the saw using his handsaw. Right? And finally somebody called him out on it and said, "What the heck are you doing? Just hold on to it." No, no, I have to have two hands on the saw. So,
Yeah, I could see
perfect
Tobias doing that.
example. Yeah, it's like you only know what you know. And he had obviously a much different mentor than I did.
Right, right, absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
It's
Dwayne,
funny that we got into one hand discussion with our last guest, and it's interesting. It shows up again. Go ahead, you're going to ask.
oh, interesting. Yeah, well, just wanted to say thank you for sharing that story of your climbing experience and tying off the taut line with one hand, because now I know I'm not the only one that did it.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And it was also.
One of
Oh,
the
go
taut
ahead, Tom.
line's greatest attributes is the fact that you can tie it one-handed, right? Like
Yeah,
I mean, that was a selection criteria.
yeah,
Yeah.
true. It's true. And I did the three. I was taught. Um, it was 2 wraps and then up and then a half hitch and an over half hitch. So it was like a 2 wrap with a half over half. It wasn't a taut line or a Blake's, obviously, or a Prusik. It was tied like a taut line, but the top two made basically a clove hitch. And I
Yeah.
never had that thing roll or bind or anything. When I learned the taut line later, I quickly abandoned it because it got way tighter than I learned it. I think it was actually called a rolling hitch, but it never rolled. Like it never, my bridge never extended or changed lengths like the taut line would do.
Yeah.
Uh, and I don't know, but you said 3 wrap taut line. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Was
So
it 2 and 1, two under, one over?
I would take the bridge and I'd say I got to think about it now. It's been a long time since I've tied that.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So yeah, gosh, I'm gonna have to bust out a rope and try it, Dwayne.
Well, it's funny. I find it interesting because sometimes change happens for the sake of change, it seems, or popularity, and like even to this day, I've occasionally tied the first hitch I ever used, and it works fine. It works fine on modern rope. It doesn't roll out, it doesn't slide, doesn't creep, and it doesn't get really tight. And I'm like, I don't know, it's still pretty cool. I mean, it's in a traditional system, but um, it works. And I don't know. It's interesting, I changed because it wasn't recognized, and I was, I better use something. And it wasn't long after that I started using the Blakes anyway. But um, even the Blake, I don't know if it had all the features of that rolling hitch, whatever you want to call it, was interesting though. But I do like, it's interesting hearing about, people's progression. So, which kind of leads me into like, when did you make the leap? Did you make the leap in college to the newer climbing methods, or was it something that happened already in your production career, I guess you could call it?
Yeah, well, I remember Bob Phillips teaching me the Blakes at a conference one time. I think it was a New York State and into them. And I was kind of like, dude, that's so awesome. And I remember when the split tail came out, and I was like, oh wow, I can maneuver around branches. And then I remember one of my favorite harnesses was a Buckingham Model 1340, which had a sliding D ring. It was a big, heavy leather thing, of course,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
but had a sliding D ring, and that offered me so much more mobility. And so there's all these innovations happening, and back then, there's a strong rock climbing community up here, and I had some friends that were rock climbers. And I used to do some almost like Jumaring single rope
yeah.
stuff,
Okay, yeah, 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 yeah,
set like a canopy anchor and sort of Jumar up with just a hodgepodge of ascenders and whatever you could kind of piece together. I remember we
yeah,
used to learn so much from the rock climbing world
yeah,
back, because really nobody was making anything for arborists. I mean, gosh, we started out with just a few ropes, and now you open up the Cheryl catalog, and it's a plethora of ropes. So
oh,
yeah, it's
yeah,
the progression has been kind of steady. Um, I think one of the things that I think I kind of missed out on in the industry was going to some of the competitions, because
mm,
that's such a breeding ground for new ideas and sharing information. And, I had the college, which was to a degree, it forced me to try to, keep up with new things and, be able to share and explain those things. So that definitely honed my edge a little bit, being an instructor at the college. But again, you're teaching a lot of
mm,
times kids that don't know how to climb.
yeah,
So you're the professional there. But I was fortunate that I was able to be around some folks and, kind of progress. Right now I'm climbing, well, honestly, I really like the zigzag and the chicane. So I'm
yeah,
climbing single rope often. We do a lot of conifers, so, a lot of like straight up ascents.
yeah,
So
yeah,
use the big shot or an air cannon, get a rope set up there, and then just go single rope up. What I like about the zigzag and the chicane is once I get up there, if I want to switch back over to double rope, it's a
yeah,
pretty simple transition. Just get rid of the chicane and boom, there you go.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah, I think it's got quite a bit of popularity, that setup. Yeah, for sure. Um,
yeah. But, it's interesting because the mechanical friction devices, and I think they're only going to get better. But it sort of takes away that compatibility of cordage, that you have to sometimes have.
Oh,
Having some cordage there to be able to grip just right in different weather conditions or different diameters, which is cool. I mean, I kind of get into that a little bit. It's kind of fun to like experiment with that stuff, but
yeah, yeah,
say from just sort of like a no nonsense, just jump on that rope and go. So the
yeah.
mechanical devices are pretty sweet.
Well, it was a big deal when the split bridge system started coming out because it was the first time where we would use a different type of cordage, or we could use a different types of cordage for the hitch because since the early, as far back as we have recorded knowledge of arboriculture in North America, at least, you use the tail of the knot exiting your termination, right? So it was the same rope. It was the same construction that you would form your climbing hitch with, right? And when that changed, it really changed everything. And all these factors became such important considerations, and some of us would learn the hard way how important they were. And then people started experimenting with diameters. So now we're seeing, thinner diameters and different construction. So now you've added two variables that totally change things. And then, the higher performance hitches like the Mashaw and the VT. VT obviously, becoming by far more popular. It's releasability and the speed at which it would allow one to move, particularly in descent. Obviously, now you had heat becoming an issue, right? And I remember the grand quest for, I remember I was with Paul Sisson out of Seattle, and who I met through Arbormaster, and he calls me one day and he says, I found this stuff at a sailing shop, Ultratech, and it's got a heat resistive core. It won't melt. And all of a sudden, now it would take probably a week. Then it took 6 months to get around, by phone call and whatever. All of a sudden, like every place was selling out of Ultratech sets and going, what the heck's going on? We never sold so much Ultratech in our life. What's happening? And then that would herniate. And so they ended up making a warp speed, which was made for climbing, that the era of all of that. But yeah, now that with the mechanicals, and Tony, I'm curious what you would say about that. If the mechanicals are less finicky or complain less with different ropes, or is it still? I know that some of them have adjustments that so you can adjust the friction and so on. But is it? Do you still have to watch it as much? You're muted, Tony. Sorry, don't know if you know.
I got it. I was supposed to hit the button and it didn't work. Anyway, yeah, I think the mechanicals are actually a little more finicky, especially when it comes.
Wow.
Now there's certain, like the zigzags. One thing, like you can get a rope too small through there, but that's fairly obvious. But you can't get too big of a rope through, like the rope runner and stuff, and the akimbo. One of the reasons I don't recommend them for newer climbers is, they're like, well, how do you know if it's going to hold you or like, what I mean? Like that adjustment takes experience to get just right. It's like a climber with a hitch. Like you knew when your hitch cord was bad because it just didn't let go anymore. It was so fuzzy and worn out. And I always tell people with hitch cord climbing, like you had the perfect week, where it was just worn enough, but not worn out.
Yeah.
And now I've switched mostly to climbing mechanicals now because I climb so infrequently. I like the consistency of it, right? Like when I was climbing full time, I was going through, hitch cords on a regular basis, not wasting them or anything, but I go through quite a few in a year. So I don't have that amount of volume anymore. So it's easier for me to find consistency with with the zigzag and the fact that I can switch over to the chicane, works better. But I still always have a hitch cord system with me. I just think, I always found it, the guys are like, well, if you tie your hitch and then you put two little twists on the end, I'm like, if you really honestly think that makes a difference, you need to work way harder than you're working right now. I'm sorry, you're not getting any fucking tree work done if that's making a difference for you. So I mean, but I run into a lot of climbers now, like they want to go right up to with a rope runner, and it's like it's not adjusted right, and they're like, "Well, I just can't get this thing adjusted." It's because they just don't have the feel. You know, they
Yeah.
haven't been on it.
Right.
They haven't hanging off a piece of rope long enough to have the feel for it. You know.
Yeah.
You bring up a good point, Tony, and I think that it's really important for, and I also have cord and a hitch climber pulley with me every time I go up. Um, you know, I think that every climber should know the basics and should be able to tie a really basic system. Just maybe I'm old fashioned, but I feel like, hey, if you lose a beaner and you don't have enough to complete your system or whatever happens.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we were doing this remote job up here in the wintertime last winter, and we had to go in by snowmobile. And it was only like 2 miles in, but whatever. It's like this rough half logging road, half hiking trail.
Yeah.
Get back in there, and something had happened. Of course. So what we do is behind the snowmobile, we've got a tote sled, and we throw the gear on that, and strap it down, and then carry it in that way. Drag it behind the snowmobile. Get back in there, looking at the climbing gear, and one of the carabiners, and as you guys know, the zigzag is a little bit particular about some of the carabiners. It's got like that one carabiner that needs to be like
Yeah.
that construction. That thing was bent. Somehow, in the transportation going across that rough trail, that one carabiner somehow got bent. And to this day, I don't even know. But here I am. It's like, oh, and it's just one of those beaners that's like isn't like really all that universal. So, I think it's important to be able to, you know, adapt.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. It's funny. My son, who's 27 and been climbing basically his whole career, and he's got easy 10 years plus already, and he now is saying, you got to know. He really feels strongly. You just got to know. He thinks it's great. What's funny? It was only a few years ago. I showed him. I said, "Well, I got a new rope. It was sent or whatever." And he's like, "Oh, it'd be great to climb." I said, "Well, you can climb on it. You don't. I don't have a harness. I got nothing here." And I said, "All you need is a rope." What do you mean? And I couldn't believe it. I never showed him a bowling on a bike with the and he still thinks it's the coolest thing ever, and he said that, like, and I said, well, he said, you never taught me that. And I said, well, we don't really teach it. And he's like, you should. Well, you should teach someone, like, you literally, if you need to go up and do something, I mean, it might hurt a little bit. It might be a little sharp on the butt, but you can actually climb, like, tied in, and I said, yeah, well, that was done for a long time. I mean, I never climbed that way, but I was shown it. I was shown that method, and
Yeah.
I never did teach it. But I don't know. It was ironic because it was only a month or so later we were doing this rescue class, and he was assisting me, and he says, "Yeah, my dad could do it with just the rope." And he said, "Dad, show him." And I was, thank goodness we were in these short little trees. Because so of course I had to do it, and actually did the rescue with just a rope. So I agree. I don't know, Tony. I think you probably tend to agree more in that way too.
Oh, yeah, I take it even a step further. I run into climbers who've been doing it for a while. Like they're at that 7, 8 year. They're very technically proficient, good climbers. Well, and they always ask me like, "What's next?" And like, technically, like from a technical standpoint, I'm like, you know what? Go back to the beginning. Strip it all down. Go back to a simple pulley, Blake's hitch, split tail system. You don't got to go, or even go further back. Just snap on the end, run out. Tie a Blake's hitch and just start all again. And I've done that a number of times in my career, not only as a climber, but I've done it in my martial arts practice. Like, just strip it all down, take all the fancy stuff away, and go back to the beginning and start again. And then you really start to appreciate all the other things. And like, you don't got to do it forever, but I'll often just strip all the climbing system down and just climb nothing but Blake's hitch and a split tail and a carabiner instead of a micro pulley. I don't have a bunch of harnesses, so I still have my my regular harness. I don't go all the way back to a butt strap saddle. I don't have one of those in stock anymore. But yeah, and just go all the way back to the beginning and start again. you know and no, I think all new climbers need to have the skill set, because you have to understand where you came from before you know where you're getting to. And then you're right, when everything goes, like, I still climb on a Blake's hitch with a snap because I'll use the other end of my rope. in large spreading trees. As a like just a quick retie in. I just need to go over here and do this little bit of work, and yeah, so
Yeah.
I still use a Blake Stitch to this day pretty consistently in larger trees.
I think one of my favorite things that you've ever given me, Tony, is we stand on the shoulders of giants, and really what we're touching upon here is just the progression of arboriculture, and in particular in this discussion, climbing progressions. But it's amazing, just how far we've come and how dynamic it is today. It's really impressive because now you have companies like Petzl and Teufelberger and God knows how many others who are making specific gear for tree climbers,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah, yeah.
really, really awesome. We're at I think that, we've lived through an amazing time in arboriculture and we're still living through it, and we're each connected to it in various ways. And I think that's really beautiful to see how far it's come. But it is important to always remain grounded, and to sort of get back to the basics once in a while, as you were saying.
And I think it's also part of the gift of that has been, and it's one of the reasons I started calling this the Human Forestry Podcast is the connections and parallels that have come from all of this tree stuff, like not just the equipment, but then the trees themselves and the interconnectedness of everything, and how much we can apply it to so many aspects of our life. And we get to this stage at some point, typically in our discussions, and I'm curious if you'd be willing to share how or ways you draw parallels from trees, either how trees grow and how they interact with fungi and so on in the forest, or how climbing or equipment and its progression has impacted the choices you've made in your life or helped you deal with hardship, or have you drawn those parallels?
Mm. Yeah, I think about this sometimes. It's a really good question and a challenging question, to be honest with you, Dwayne. That's a really tough question because, as tree workers, if you're doing production tree care, at some point in your career, you're going to run into a sketchy tree. Whether it's a tree that's compromised structurally or exposed or, pushing your limits in one way or another, maybe physically, maybe mentally, right? And that's a challenge. Tree climbing is as much a mental game as it is a physical game. And, I think that it draws a certain kind of person, who loves being outdoors, who loves the physicality of it, loves the adrenaline, um, who is a complex problem solver, who is capable of making decisions on the fly. There's so many aptitudes to being a production arborist. And yet, I sometimes wonder, does that have its drawbacks? Are we maybe not organized enough because we're always solving problems on the fly? Or, you know, there's times when you lay your life on the line. You're literally like, I think this will work. But if it doesn't, things could go horribly wrong, right? Have you
Mm-hmm.
ever been in that position?
Mm-hmm.
And, to just have the fortitude to be in the position and do that and know that you are alone because maybe you're up on a spar, you're 60 feet away from friends, that you're several minutes to maybe much longer to getting any sort of help. And so you're
Mm-hmm.
literally laying your life on the line with some of the decisions that you make. And I sometimes wonder, how does that influence a tree climber's psyche? And does that roll over into other aspects of our lives, maybe on a personal level or a financial level? It's interesting to think about those things. And I'm curious to hear what you guys think about that.
Well, I mean, I certainly think it does. I know in my own life it has definitely manifested in various ways. Certainly my extracurricular activities, were influenced by that. I guess, I think I would have originally described it as youth, but I think it was more than that for me. It was the thrill and the thrill. And I wouldn't have been able to identify it as thrill seeking, and I don't know that I would now, but it was definitely something about that, the high or the rush. But that did also, lead me down other dark rivers that I, had to find my way out of later in life. And even after the risks in the trees gave way, and I wasn't putting myself into those stimulating environments, I found other creative ways to do that. And I think that is something that's important to realize about tree workers and about our psyche and the way we are, because I think, substance abuse, we'll just call it that for now, is prevalent because of that. It's because of the way we are in this industry. And I think it's something we need to put a bit more of a light on and say it for what it is. Kind of like one hand and a saw, like it isn't good, and there's a lot of places that still it's routine to celebrate that thrill of being on the line, and it just carries into the evening, sometimes into the wee hours, and then it repeats. And some people are on a loop of that. I was for a long time. And then when the tree work stops and you're educating, you're doing something else, you like the loop. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think we need to give it a voice to a certain extent in the industry. I don't know when and how that'll happen, but I had a long discussion with Mark Bridge after our episode about it, and he feels strongly that it's something that we need to be able to communicate to, especially the new younger group, that this is all cool and good, but like, they can come at a cost, at a great cost emotionally and spiritually, at some point. I don't know if that makes sense. Tony, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. In this point in my career, I get a lot of questions. If you could turn back the clock, what would you do? What would you do differently? What advice would you give? And what I tell people now, when they ask, is I would find better ways to recover and to cope and to compensate, because when tree workers for me I've never been on the outside looking in. For me, you worked hard all day, you worked really hard all day, you did a very hazardous job that most people couldn't do. And then, the way you unwound is you came back and you drank some beers with your buddy and you told bad jokes, and that was just part of the culture. And, I've seen a lot of people take that culture too far to addiction, that it was the stepping stone into it. And I look back now, like in, my 20s and 30s, it's like you worked hard all day, didn't drink enough water because you just had, because coming out of the tree to get a drink of water just wasn't acceptable. You just had to keep going. The job wasn't done yet. You'll drink plenty of time to drink water when we're done working. So then you'd go back and you'd crack a couple beers, and then by the time you're sitting there, you fall asleep and just repeat. And I look at what it could have led me to. It didn't lead me to any addiction problems, and I having been exposed to that through my personal life, I'm fortunate that didn't. I've met a lot of people that haven't. But I tell a lot of people now, I wish then that I'd had taken up playing guitar, which is one of the ways that I tend to cope. And now, I wish I'd found better ways to sort those thoughts out. One of the things that drew me to tree work was that mental clarity when you're doing a hazardous job, and it wasn't, I wouldn't say it's an adrenaline rush, because it wasn't that. It wasn't like being on an amusement park ride. It wasn't like, wee, big, exciting. What I loved about it is I was so focused that all my senses were in tune, and I could hear the wood fibers cracking and know when I could stop cutting, and I could just feel it. And it was, and, to have that, that clarity, it took all that, the work and everything to do that. And when I wasn't doing it anymore, I found myself missing it. And then, like Dwayne had said, trying to find, well, how else can I get that? How else can I do that? For me, fortunately, because, I grew up in a home with addicts and people that were addicted and codependents, I could see the downslide there, right? I'd seen it happen. It's like I'd seen the puzzle all put together and the pieces come apart. And that was fortunate for me that I didn't have to put all the pieces together to see the whole puzzle. From the get-go, I could do it from backwards. So And I think it is something that needs to be discussed. And that, I tell people, young arborists now, if you don't take the time to recover, you won't. So take the time physically, mentally, spiritually, however you go through the world. Find things that you can unwind with, other than this standard, drink too much, other mind altering substances. Or, I watched my father was never much of an alcoholic, but man, did that man just never stop working. He just didn't know how. He didn't know how to stop working, um, and it, and he suffered for that. I suffered for that as his, the youngest of three, because, he wasn't always available, because the only way he knew how to cope with hard work was, we'll come home and work even harder. So, those are the things I'd say is find ways to do that. And I agree with both of you. It's a topic that really, really needs to be addressed for people to get into this industry, because I see so many people, especially now, there's a new awareness with, like, my daughter has a different awareness about these types of things. And someone like her with this awareness will see the writing on the wall and just leave. She's like, well, if that's all there is, I'm not doing that. Right. And I can't say as I blame her, but what I would impress upon him is there's other ways. There's other ways to deal with it. Right? You can have your cake and eat it too. You really can.
Yeah. And I think that the industry, to some degree, actually draws in people who maybe have that lifestyle, you know, they maybe have some of those tendencies or are risk takers to some degree. And maybe if they're risk takers on a professional end, or they're risk takers on a personal end too. And I think that that's where it's really important. And I did see this on a project down in West Virginia, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, where there was this relatively young crew who was working, and West Virginia, steep mountainsides, ended up, a fatality was caused. An excavator rolled over on the tree fall. Or it's a long story that I don't want to get into too much, but the takeaway for this conversation is that these guys were all relatively young, and I think maybe having an older person on the crew might have moderated some of that testosterone that was just oozing out of that crew. But also, um, I had asked them. I said, "Hey, after the crew leader actually came up and wanted to talk to me. This is like 2 months afterwards, and I said, hey, the emergency response plan that you guys had, the ERP, I know that your crew member, it was a fatality, but did that help you at all?" And he said, yeah, it actually did, and it actually helps us to talk about it. But he said, just even though we couldn't help our fallen crew member, comrade, all of us knew what to do, and we all executed it perfectly. So whoever was going to call 911 went and called 911, and the backup was right there with them, and another person went and got the first aid. So their plan worked flawlessly, even though it ended up being a fatality. But that helped them mentally know that they did the best that they could. And then I was really impressed at how they sort of with their after action review, and just the open discussion that they were having, not only amongst themselves, but with other people, involved in the industry. I thought that was really great of them. I thought that was a strong move on their part. And I think that it really helped with processing these things, so I think that as a forest, right, we're all better together. And, if we can help hold each other up and hone each other, and, help each other grow and rejuvenate each other, that's really important. And I think that having the ability to share stories, I always, and Tony, I know you and I have talked about this, but, sharing war stories is sometimes beneficial, sometimes not. If you're sharing war stories just for like your own glorification, that's no good, right? But if you're sharing a story about an incident that happened so that others can learn from it, like John Ball says, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? And so being able to share stories is really important. I think teaching tree workers and enabling them, giving them space to be able to talk about their experiences, positive or negative, I think is really important. Yeah, and look at this podcast. I mean, this is great. You guys are doing this. You're opening up doors for people to be able to share things. That's awesome.
Well, it was definitely one of the, um, you know, we quip about the fact that we're so unorganized, we repeat, but, it wasn't without, some thought and, you know, it originally, the podcast was to connect, well, it was just within our instructional team to connect some of our older instructors that have moved on and even retired with some of our new ones. And after the very first episode, we realized that it could be broader than that. And we just, after the first episode, and the names that kept coming up from the people that person learned from were broader in scope than just our circle of instructors. So we just said, you know what, heck with it. And it's really, that's why it's the human forest, and our people's reactions to having like sharing their experiences of growing up in the human forest. And I really like, again, we are stronger together, and like a forest, it takes all ages and types and species and mushrooms and, under canopies, like it's all connected. And a well, a well, a well, how do I put this? I think many of us have been lucky enough to have been on a crew where it just functioned. I remember one summer in particular, we had this crew, and one of the guys was in his early 50s. I was in my late 20s, mid 20s. We had two young guys that were, they were younger than me. They were like teenage, just out of high school kind of thing, college, university kids. And we were unstoppable, man. Like, we had so much fun, and we could, like, customers would just be blown away. They like, we were here to do this. Yeah. Okay. And we'd be handing them the invoice. They said, what do you get? And like, someone's loading the stump grinder up as I'm giving them, and we're off, and, and it's the blending. It's not just, you have all young trees in your forest. There's something wrong with the forest. If you have all old trees, you need that generational cycle. And there's so many parallels that we can learn from the forest and how trees interact that in our lives. And it's why I asked that question to people. So, and I think, our mycorrhizal network is storytelling, right? That's how
Okay.
we share those resources.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah. I don't know if we're mushrooms or if we're trees, but there's some with some of us maybe are mushrooms, and some maybe when you become a teacher, you become a mushroom, a fungi. I don't know, but it's been great chatting, Dan.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been great, guys. Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't know, where are we at, Tony? How are we sitting?
Oh, I got all day.
Dan, it's I always find it fascinating how things go, because we've stumbled on some really cool range of topics in this episode. And what the range of topics that we've gone through, I think it really is it's been a good range of topics.
Yeah. Yeah, we've covered a wide swath.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.